Hi, so today we're going to take some notes on chapter 24, which is the origin of species. You've all already read it, so hopefully most of this is just going to be a review for you. Please make sure that you push pause as often as necessary to get the information that you need. But today what we'll be talking about is how new species develop from original species. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I thought we should start with what exactly is a species. There are several different types of species or ways to define a species. We're going to use what's called the biological species concept that was developed by Ernst Mayr. And then it is defined as a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So viable means that they're living, and fertile means that they can have offspring themselves, so they're not sterile. And also that their offspring are not sterile. So it has to be for 2 generations. So they can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So that's called being reproductively compatible, which means that your sperm fits in with somebody's egg of the same species. Okay, so let's take a look at these meadowlarks. They are both distinct species. Their songs and their behaviors are different enough to prevent interbreeding. So although if you look at them, they look very, very similar. But because they don't live in the same place, you have the eastern meadowlark that obviously lives in the east, and the western meadowlark who lives in the west coast. If they come together, they're not going to be able to reproduce. They have enough behaviors that they would not be attracting members of the opposite species. Okay, so let's look at some examples of how these new species originate. So they're created by a series of evolutionary processes. So the first thing that has to happen is that the population has to become isolated for some reason. Because otherwise, if they're living together the whole time and nothing is different about them, then they would be no reason for new species to form. One way that they can become isolated is by being geographically isolated. Like if you look in this example here in A, these are obviously geographically isolated. There's land in between the two. So they are no longer going to be living together. Or they could become reproductively isolated for some reason, and that would be what's happening in here. And we'll talk about some ways that can happen in a couple minutes. So isolated populations evolve independently. So no matter if it's isolated because there is some physical barrier between them, like here, or in this case that they're somehow reproductively isolated, they evolve independently. They don't depend on each other. All right, so the 2 different types of isolation, you have allopatric. The prefix allo means other, and patric is referring to father. So other, father, and basically what that means is that they have had a geographic separation. They are now living in another place, so an other place. So they're geographically separated from one another. The other type is called sympatric speciation. The prefix sym means the same, and father is still, or patric is still father, obviously. And so that means that they're going to be living in the same area. Okay, living in the same area as their ancestors, in other words. Okay, so those are the 2 types, and as we go through these next few examples, we'll talk about if it's allopatric or sympatric. The first type of reproduction barrier that we'll talk about are called pre-reproduction barrier, or you'll sometimes see it called pre-zygotic barriers. And these are obstacles to mating or to fertilization if mating occurs. So you will not ever get any kind of offspring. These are the ones that we will be talking about in more detail. We'll talk about all 6 of those, so you don't necessarily have to write those all down right now. We're going to go through each one individually. So let's talk about geographic isolation first. So species occur in different areas. You have these little chipmunks that live on either side of the Grand Canyon, so that's a pretty big barrier in between the 2 species. Some sort of physical barrier. It could be a river, it could be a canyon in this case, it could be a mountain, it could be an ocean, whatever. But this is allopatric speciation, other country. Okay, so these little, what's called an antelope squirrel inhabits the canyon's south rim. And then on the north rim lives closely related another type of antelope squirrel. But they are not the same species because they do not live in the same place. So they do not reproduce with one another. Okay, that's the first one, and that was allopatric. The second one is ecological isolation. So the species occur in the same region, but occupy different habitats, so they rarely encounter each other. So although they live in the same part of the country, they live in a completely different habitat. So like in the example of those snakes, the one lives on the land and the one lives in the water, even though they're living in pretty much the same place, but they don't ever encounter each other. So they are reproductively isolated. So reproductively isolated, again, is referring to sympatric, since they're not geologically isolated. So they occur in the same area, but one lives in water and the other one lives on land, so they rarely meet, so they don't reproduce. So different species. Okay, different species. Lions and tigers are another example. They could potentially mate, but since they live in different habitats, they don't. Lions live in the grasslands, tigers live in the rainforest. And I know that you've all heard of ligers or tigons, and that has been done, but not in nature. So remember, that was another key part of our definition of a species. They are found together in nature. It's not, we can do it in a lab someplace. Okay, the next one is called temporal isolation. Temporal is referring to season, so species that breed during different times during different times. That can be different times of day, different seasons, different years, whatever. It doesn't have to be a drastic different time. It's just a different time, so they wouldn't reproduce. So again, these are reproductively isolated. So it's sympatric speciation because they can live in the same place, but they just don't meet because they're not reproducing during the same time. But again, remember, the time can be different times of day. It doesn't have to be a dramatic different time. So these are some skunks that overlap. The eastern mates in late winter and the western mates in late summer. So it's living in the same place, but not at the same time. Okay, the next one is behavioral isolation. And this is unique behavioral patterns and rituals that isolate species. So I know many of you know that birds have some elaborate songs, some elaborate dances that they do when they're reproducing or getting ready to reproduce. It identifies the members of a particular species. And then that's how they attract their mates, some of them. So that can be courtship rituals, that would be the dance that we talked about. Mating calls being the song that we talked about. But it's reproductive isolation. And this one can be sympatric as well because they can live in the same place, do different dances or have different calls and different songs, and not be attracted to each other. Okay, the next one is called mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation means that they really don't have anything to separate them. There's not a, it can be reproducing at the same time. It can be reproducing with similar coloration, like in the example of these plants. It's like, but the difference is that you have to have a particular thing help it. So reproductive mechanical isolation means it's not the right shape, so they don't fit together. So you have the flowers have distinctive appearances, in this case, that attract different pollinators. So therefore they cannot cross-pollinate. It's basically that the parts do not fit together. Okay, so kind of like a key going into a lock, it has to be the right key going into that lock. In this case, it has to be the right pollinator going into the flower to help it get it pollinated. Okay? Another example, when we look at animals with mechanical isolation, for many insects, the male and female sex organs do not fit together correctly, so it prevents sperm transfer because and the penis won't fit into whatever the female part is called. So in humans, obviously that would be the vagina, but it's different for different animals. So it's a lack of fit between sexual organs. Okay? All right, the next one is gametic isolation. Gametic isolation means that perhaps fertilization was attempted, but the sperm cannot fertilize the egg. So there's no way for them to be able to reproduce. So sea urchins release sperm and eggs into the water where they fuse and form zygotes. I was looking for the picture.